So from Mr. Mike Sheldon, we have where are features tested? So in the branching workflow that we looked at in the presentation, basically our features are tested both manually and in an automated fashion by continuous integration. So testing typically happens by developers at first when they review the pull request. So we typically encourage developers to actually build and run the branch when they're doing code review, not just review the code changes themselves. So this sort of catches any kind of early problems with the features. But then we also continue to test those when it gets merged into the develop branch. So from develop, we continuously deploy to our dog fooding or staging servers, and that means that the rest of the team are immediately starting to interact with that feature, which means, again, we can catch regressions before it actually ships to our customers. Similarly, automatic testing happens from our continuous integration server Bamboo, and this happens both on the feature branch before it's merged, and again on the develop branch once those features are merged together, so we get proper integration testing. So we have another question here from Aaron Alal, asking how would the branch all the things workflow work for a solo developer with several different features? So the simple answer to this is that branching and merging is cheap in Git, and if you're a solo developer, there's still some value there if you're using continuous integration, because it means you can basically branch off your master branch, make some changes relating to a feature, and then push that up to your Git repository so your continuous integration server builds it. This means that if there is a regression caused by some feature development, you'll know exactly which feature is causing that breakage when you break a test. If you're not using continuous integration, then doing a lot of branching as a solo developer isn't quite as useful, but you still might consider doing it for things like a long-running feature so that your master branch is still stable, or if you're doing some risky work like a big refactor that may not work out, because then you can choose not to merge that in later on. So we've got another good technical question here. Can you cover the difference between merge --ff only versus a rebase? So the ff only flag that you can pass to the merge command is basically an indicator that you only want to allow a merge to take place if the base commit of the branch is the same as the tip of your master branch. So usually you'll use the merge ff only flag if you're actively rebasing your feature branch to look as if it was coming directly from your master branch or had been built off the tip commit of your master branch. So as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, a rebase is where you change the base commit of your branch. So you basically rewrite all of the commits to look as if the branch had been originally created from a different commit, usually the tip of master. Whereas performing a merge with the ff only flag basically means that Git will only allow that merge to proceed if the base commit of your branch is the tip of master. So you kind of use the two things in combination. We've got another question here from Mike Hester. How do you find or detect when prior unfixed issues have caused the current issue to fail? So I'm assuming here this is where you're sort of working on an issue and then you find out that the regression or a bug that's apparent in the issue that you're working on is actually caused by a previous issue that you've been working on. Usually continuous integration and code review will help us catch issues before they get merged to master. But where there is an existing issue causing problems during the development of a new feature, it will usually be caught by the developer working on that new feature and fixed by them working on their feature branch. If they need to pull in another specialist or maybe the person who worked on that feature branch, there's what will usually happen is the developer will push that branch to a shared server to the repository, get the developer who introduced that problem to fix it on that branch, and then they'll continue working together in isolated fashion on that branch, and then basically do the feature development workflow that we described earlier as normal. So we've got another question here from Chanakaya. Is it mandatory for each developer to have their own server to test their changes? Yeah, look, typically yes. If a developer can't build and deploy their code to a test server, then they're going to have a hard time developing their code because they can't run it. Ideally, you should be able to run your code locally on your own development machine, without deploying to an external server, though obviously for some SaaS-based development platforms like Salesforce, that isn't possible because you're kind of writing modules that end up running on somebody else's platform. But yes, I would say typically every developer needs to be able to run and deploy their code, or, so they can test it during development before it gets merged in and tested or dog-fooded by the rest of the team. So we have another question here. So from Doug Harold. So on a pull request, if your feature branch is not getting merged to your develop branch, other developers are pulling your feature branch to their repositories so they can code review it. So typically at Atlassian, we're usually dog-fooding our own product. So we're either using Stash for hosting our Git code, or Bitbucket, which is our publicly accessible Git hosting site. Allows you to host free private repositories if you're interested in checking it out. So usually, rather than having a developer pulling the feature branches to their repository, they'll basically be reviewing the code online in Bitbucket or in Stash using the pull request UI. They will occasionally pull it down to their repositories locally if they're going to run it up and test it locally, which, as I mentioned before, we do encourage it, but it sort of depends a little bit on the nature of the change. Usually a developer will run up and test somebody else's branch if it's like a brand new feature that they need to do some testing. If it's kind of like a minor bug fix where the change is fairly isolated, then sometimes they'll just look at the diff instead and approve that rather than pulling the branch down and building it themselves. So we have another question here from JD. How would I use cherry picking in my workflow? So that's kind of interesting. In the SaaS workflow I described, typically you don't do cherry picking. The git cherry pick command is kind of like a miniature rebase. It takes a single commit from one branch and transplants it as a new commit onto the tip of another branch. So you're basically rewriting the commit and then applying it to another branch. Now, we don't usually use that kind of as a matter of course when we're doing feature branching and merging. The only time that I really use cherry picking is when I have a feature branch that for some reason I don't want to merge, but it does have like a good commit somewhere in its history that I want to save. So for example, I might have a branch where I've done some crazy refactoring and it didn't quite pan out, and I'm basically never going to merge that back into master. But during that refactor, I might have found and fixed like an unrelated bug. If this is the case, then I'd use cherry pick to transplant that single commit from my big ugly refactor branch over to master, but then I'd leave the rest of that branch unmerged. So let me just scroll down here and I'll take a look and see if I've got some more questions. Okay, so from Pavel Morozov, it is not clear for me, should I test hotfix in hotfix branch or should I merge it into development branch and test it in development branch? So if you've got continuous integration up and running and you're using pull requests for code review, then yes, you should absolutely test it in isolation first on your hotfix branch. So basically, yeah, like you'd still do the pull request workflow where you create a pull request from your hotfix back into develop. And then do all of your regular testing and continuous integration there. Then you merge them into develop, and then basically that'll get deployed to your staging server, and you can do some acceptance testing there. And then you merge that hotfix branch back into production to make it deployed. So basically, yeah, you'd still run the same kind of set of quality checks on your hotfix branch as if it's a regular feature branch. Thanks for that feedback. Actually, I'll incorporate that back into the slide deck to make that clearer in future. So we've got another question here. What's the best solution from Eric Martin? What's the best solution for doing pull requests across multiple Stash repositories? So it sort of depends what you're using the multiple Stash repositories for. If it's if the Stash repositories are related, so they're like they're forks of each other, containing branches that are historically related, so they share a common ancestor, then you can use that same pull request mechanism to stage changes between those repositories. So I've seen some setups where teams have different repositories representing different staging environments. So they might have like a dog food fork and a UAT fork and a production fork. Usually I recommend not doing that, but it can work in some environments, particularly in a SaaS context. But yeah, look, the best way to stage changes between those is to use a pull request, just as if you were doing a pull request between two different branches. So I have another question here from Virgilio. If I have a team that work each with a specific area, for example, designers, HTML, front-end developers, PHP developers, we need to use all the branches that you explained, even if we don't touch the work from each other. So it's kind of an interesting question. So I've fielded similar questions before where, you've got maybe some very front-end heavy developers and some back-end heavy developers working on the same team, and do you want to sort of cross-pollinate code review between the two of them? On most of the cross-disciplinary teams that I've worked on, yes, we usually do like to do that, just so that each team is kind of aware of what's going on. You don't necessarily need to have people of a different specialization approve those pull requests, but it can be nice to add them as a reviewer, just so they're aware that those changes are taking place. If you kind of have like one front-end specialist, one designer, and one back-end specialist, then it doesn't really make sense for them to be able to be actually like reviewing each other's changes, but it's still a kind of a good communication mechanism to have these pull requests in place. And if that's the case, you can always relax that requirement of having mandatory approvers in Stash. So we've got another couple of questions here. One from A. Colpitz. Where can we find a write-up of the concepts mentioned in the webinar? I'm specifically interested in the branching model as well as continuous integration. If you're interested, there is a Git microsite maintained by Atlassian, which a lot of the people who are interested in Git, such as myself and the rest of the Bitbucket and Stash teams, regularly contribute to. You can find it at atlassian.com/git. And it has a whole bunch of different workflow documentations and tips for migration and other valuable information about working with Git and the various different sort of workflows that can be mapped onto different software projects. If you look in that area in the tutorial section for a workflow talking about feature branching, then that will cover a lot of the concepts that I've covered during this presentation. Also, we'll be uploading the entire presentation deck to SlideShare and an HD version of the slides and me talking over them to YouTube in the next couple of days. And we'll be sending that out to everybody who registered for the webinar today. So I think if you can hear me, you probably are registered with your email address. So definitely keep an eye on your inbox, and we'll have that content out for you soon. So we've got another question here from Jose Hugo. How would be the best workflow for a small team project with a small amount of code, but with complicated algorithms? In my case, number crunching and scientific computing algorithms. So kind of asking about the best workflow is, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, like the best workflow is a fairly subjective term. It does depend very heavily on your team. But I would recommend using a feature branching workflow like we described in the presentation today, particularly if you're working with a lot of kind of complicated algorithms. It's quite important to write a lot of unit tests to make sure that if you tweak those algorithms, you don't cause a regression to occur. In fact, usually for the kind of heavy scientific stuff, like test-driven development can be quite a good way to go, where you actually write a set of unit tests first to ensure that the algorithm you create actually fulfills the requirements of what you're designing. So I would recommend a feature branching workflow where you have continuous integration building both the feature branches that you create and your develop or master branch as well. Definitely check out, if you want like a kind of a succinct description of that feature branching workflow and some information on how to check it, on how to actually set that up, definitely check out the microsite that I mentioned before at atlassian.com/git. Okay, we've got some more questions here. One from Mikhail. Hello, what do you use as a merge tool for Git and Atlassian? So that's kind of an interesting question. It depends a little bit on what language you're developing in. Usually, I personally use, because I'm a Java developer by trade, I use IntelliJ IDEA, and it has quite a nice interface for doing kind of a three-way merge where you can compare the from branch, the to branch, and then the intersection of the two, and basically select which changes you want to stage between them. So I usually recommend sticking with your IDE for doing merges. That said, we also do maintain a free Git GUI tool you can use for interacting with your repository called SourceTree. So if you just Google for source tree or Atlassian source tree, you'll be able to find that. And it has basically a really nice way of doing conflict resolution during a merge. Other than that, there's a bunch of other kind of like free tools out there for doing merges. I'd probably search for merging and then the language that you're working with to try and find out kind of what the best of breed is. But yeah, typically like the short answer would be if your IDE supports merging, I'd try and stick with your IDE. Otherwise, check out source tree. It might help you out. Let's see if we've got some other questions here.